Hello, welcome to the second week of this massive open online course, Introduction to PLSQL Program Units. You are viewing the second video of this week, Handling Predefined Exceptions in PLSQL. As you know, Jill is improving the new HR administration system with more user-friendly features. In this process, she created an employee lookup directory that allows users to enter a search string and get a list of all employees having the search string as part of their names. While testing this feature, Jill notices that it works successfully only when the search string is part of a single employee's name. In a case where the search string is present in more than one employee's names, or where it's not part of any employee's name, the application does not display the expected results. Can you guess why? To answer this question, we need to look at the PLSQL program that has the corresponding logic. This program is terminating abruptly whenever the SQL query retrieving the employee details based on the search string returns either multiple rows or no rows. In other words, PLSQL raises a runtime error during program execution whenever the SQL query returns multiple rows or no rows. This is called an exception. An exception is an error in PLSQL that is raised during the execution of a block. But how can Jill fix this issue in her application? By handling these exceptions in the corresponding PLSQL program. Before learning how to handle PLSQL exceptions, let's discuss the types of exceptions in PLSQL. Based on how an exception is raised, they can be classified as implicitly raised exceptions and explicitly raised exceptions. As the name implies, PLSQL raises the implicitly raised exceptions automatically whenever a PLSQL runtime error occurs while executing a PLSQL program. They are again of two types as predefined exceptions and internally defined exceptions. All the implicitly raised exceptions are defined by PLSQL in a standard package with an ORA error code. However, a set of most commonly occurring runtime errors are given a name along with the ORA error code by PLSQL. They are called predefined exceptions. For example, to_many_rows is a predefined exception that gets raised whenever an SQL query returns more than one row in its result set. Those implicitly raised exceptions that do not have a name associated with them are called internally defined exceptions. For example, ORA 27102 is raised by PLSQL whenever the system runs out of memory, but it is not given a name in the standard package by PLSQL. In contrast, you as a programmer can define the user-defined exceptions to implement application-level checks depending on the business logic. You have to declare a user-defined exception in the declarative section of the program and then raise it explicitly in the executable section. We will focus on predefined exception in this video and learn about the other type of exceptions in the upcoming videos. The PLSQL program shown on the screen reproduces the exception discussed until now. For the purpose of this demonstration, let's consider zeba as the search string. The value zeba is prefixed and suffixed by the SQL wild character percentage sign and assigned to the v_last_name variable. The wild characters are required to query the records that contain zeba anywhere in their last name. Let's execute the program and see the output. The program terminated abruptly with ORA 01403 no data found. No data found is an exception raised by PLSQL when an SQL query in the PLSQL program does not retrieve even a single row from the database. To avoid such abnormal termination of the program, you can handle the exceptions in the exception block of the program. For exception handling, you include another optional section called the exception section. This section begins with the exception keyword. If present, this must be the last section in a PLSQL block. The when exception then section defines the action to be performed when an exception is raised. This is called an exception handler. Let's execute this program and see the outcome. The program executes successfully and prints the statement from the exception block. This is because during the program execution, when an exception occurs, the control shifts to the exception section and executes the statements coded in that section. You can handle any number of exceptions by adding an exception handler for each of them in the exception block. However, you cannot have multiple handlers for a single exception. In a realistic situation, the programs can be complicated with the possibility of many such exceptions. It can be quite challenging to predict all the probable exceptions in such programs. To address this, PLSQL allows you to include a generic exception handler called others handler as the last handler in the exception section. This option traps any exception that are not handled by any other exception handler in the exception block. Therefore, if the others handler is used, it must be the last exception handler that is defined. Let's modify our previous program to change the declaration of v_last_name to generate ORA06502 PLSQL numeric or value error, which is not handled in the exception block. We also added the others handler in the exception block now. When you execute this program, PLSQL raises the PLSQL numeric or value error. Since there is no specific handler defined for this exception, the control passes to the others handler and executes the statements coded under it. To get an end-to-end picture of exception handling in PLSQL, let's look at a flow diagram. Observe that we already discussed trapping an exception and handling the exception in the exception section to terminate the program gracefully. But what happens if an exception that is raised is not trapped and handled in the program? In this case, the program terminates abruptly and it propagates to the environment from which it is called, either another PLSQL block or an external environment such as SQL Developer. Let's understand what is meant by exception propagation. Consider a PLSQL program having subblocks as shown on the screen. Suppose an exception is raised in the subblock. PLSQL looks for the corresponding exception handler in the subblock. But when it does not find one, then it reproduces the exception in its parent block or the enclosing block. It then looks for a handler in the enclosing block. Thus, the exception is reproduced in all its enclosing blocks until a handler is found. If a handler is not found in any of its enclosing blocks, the program terminates abruptly and the exception propagates to its calling environment, which determines the outcome of the exception. The calling environment can be any application like SQL Plus that invokes the PLSQL program. In this video, you should have learned what PLSQL exceptions are, their types, and how to handle predefined exceptions using an exception handler in a PLSQL block. You also got a clear idea of how exceptions propagate to their calling environment if they are not handled. In the next video, you will learn how to trap and handle internally defined exceptions in PLSQL blocks. To practice what you learned, solve the assignment posted on OLL course page. Please post your questions, if any, in the course forum whose link is shown here. Thank you for watching this video. Have a great day.